Lesson 1, Chapter 4, Measuring National Economic Activity and Performance. 1.1, Gross Domestic Product, or GDP for short. What is macroeconomics study? Macroeconomics focuses on how the economy is performing. And given the performance of the economy, what can the government and the central bank can do in order to actually improve economic activities? The types of policies that a government can actually introduce into an economy, we tend to call these fiscal policies. Fiscal policies would include government spending. For example, how much the government actually spend on healthcare, education, infrastructure, and so on. The government can also affect economic activities by deciding how much taxes they would collect from us. And taxes could be income taxes, sales taxes, GST, and so forth. The central bank, in this case for Canada, that would be the Bank of Canada. The actions of the central bank, we tend to call that monetary policies. The main monetary policy that we would focus on would be the changes in the interest rate. The Bank of Canada actually has 8 scheduled announcements per year that the Bank of Canada governor would actually go in front of the press and announces whether he would like to actually raise the interest rate, cut the interest rate, or actually keep it as it is. The commercial banks would most likely follow what the Bank of Canada does. And as a result, suppose it actually promises to cut interest rates. And most likely, what we would see as a result of being consumers are mortgage payments. Very likely is going to fall. How much we need to pay on the loans that we took out would also likely to fall, which means consumers and the firms most of the time tend to borrow some money in order to actually start a business. Our spending, because it's cheaper to borrow money, is actually very likely to rise. And hence, this will have an effect on economic activities. What kind of measurements can we actually use to reflect economic activities? We can look at the income or the wealth of Canada. And the wealth of Canada will be just summing all of the wealth of different Canadians. In the year 2007, if we add up all of the incomes of all different Canadians, we would get about 1.5 trillion Canadian dollars. But notice that this 1.5 trillion Canadian dollars were actually measured in the year 2007 prices. 1.5 trillion is for Canada as a whole. Can we find income per person on average, or sometimes we call this per capita income? The population in Canada is around 33 million. So what we need to do is, in order to find per person income, we divide the 1.5 trillion by the 33 million, and what this would give us is approximately 45,000 Canadian dollars per person or per capita. So on average, a Canadian actually makes $45,000 back in the year 2007. And what we would see throughout the course is that fiscal policies, as well as monetary policies, can actually be used to have an effect on this number, whether to actually drive it higher or to actually drive it lower. how should we measure the income of a person? And later on, we can extend this to the income of a country. Let us start off with just one single person. Suppose this person has a bakery. And for simplicity, I actually produce the flour, the eggs, and everything involved that I would need for a bakery. For a given day, suppose I actually produce 300 cupcakes, and each one is actually worth, say, $2. Altogether, for this particular day, the value of what I have produced is equal to 600. But also at the same time, because I have worked, I will get paid. What I would actually get paid, remember that we said I actually supply all of the eggs and the flour and everything involved. I don't need to pay my suppliers. This $600 will just be equal to my income because that is the value of what I have produced. Also at the same time, because I actually got paid, this allowed me to go and spend after work. My expenditure, I can actually buy other types of food, clothing, entertainment, and so forth. What this can actually show us is because of the fact that we have actually produced something, that's the value of my work today, this allowed me to actually get paid. And because I actually get paid, I can actually go and spend, which means if we want to actually look at the value of the $600, I can look at this as being the value of my production. But the $600, I can also define it as being my income. Or I can also define this as being how much I can afford to spend. And notice that expenditure, I can actually spend this on a savings account. I don't have to spend each and every penny that I earned. But I can think of I actually bought a savings account and actually put some money in. If this is true for one person, what we can now do is we can add up all of this from all of the different people in the country and get the income, production, expenditure values for one country. And each of the value has to be identical to each other. So the wealth of a country, we tend to call this gross domestic product, or GDP for short. The value of GDP, remember in the year 2007, 1.5 trillion? We could have actually gotten this number, the 1.5 trillion, by looking at the total value of the goods and services we produce as a country, or how much all of those inputs, workers, firms involved in producing this 1.5 trillion, how much were they paid? Total income? And after we actually all got paid, this allows us to go and spend total expenditure. Any one of these measurements has to give us the same value. In other words, this is kind of like saying, this is my GDP value, these are the three identical sides of the same coin, or whatever that is. A few things we should note before we move on to the next topic. Gross domestic product is calculated by the government, which means illegal activities will not be included in that 1.5 trillion. We can also argue illegal production such as drugs can also create jobs and therefore create expenditure. But for our purpose, we just want to focus on everything that is legal, being kept track of by the government. A second note, the goods and services that we produce have to be worth something in terms of in dollars. They actually involve some type of monetary transactions. They're being bought and sold. And these transactions are actually reported to the government. Some transactions, such as housework, we don't get paid, or pollution, that the firms do not have to pay to actually clean up the pollution, or babysitting, We do get paid, but we actually do not report it to the government. Otherwise, we have to pay taxes. Activities such as these will not be included in GDP because we do not report them. So that would mean that 1.5 trillion is actually an underestimation of all of the economic activities that have taken place. We only kept track of things that are legal and things that have been reported. Note number 3. The goods and services that we keep track of have to be newly produced. That means the sale of second-hand products will not be included. For example, I sell my bike to my friend and we actually pay each other in terms of in cash. This will not be reported to the government and there's actually nothing being produced. Why is that the case? Because the sale of the product itself is simply a transfer of ownership. I parked it in my garage. Now the bike is actually over at your garage. Nothing really has actually been produced, and hence there's no effect on GDP. Nominal versus real GDP. Recall that the 1.5 trillion Canadian dollars was actually measured in 2007 prices. So for simplicity, suppose we only produce one product back in the year 2007, so that 1.5 trillion was equal to the price of the product that we produced times whatever quantity that we actually have produced. Now suppose when we look at the value for the year 2006, it was only 1.4 trillion. But this 1.4 trillion was actually measured in 2006 prices. Can we now conclude 1.5 trillion actually means we're richer than before compared to 1.4? We actually cannot do so. Why is that the case? Because the 1.5 bigger than the 1.4. It could have been due to the fact that quantities that we actually have produced over the 2 years were exactly the same. So I put the bar to actually to show it has actually stayed constant. We have not produced more in terms of quantities. And yet, the prices have gone up. And very likely, when we actually go shopping, we do see that the prices compared to 2006 and 2007, very likely prices in 2007 are actually higher than those prices in 2006. So this 1.5 is bigger than 1.4 could have been simply because the price have gone up. Or it could have been the price level has not changed. It's a possibility. But it's actually because we have produced more. This is why 1.5 is higher than 1.4. Or it could be both. Or any combination in between. Quantity has actually dropped, price have actually gone up by even more, or quantity has actually increased and the price have actually dropped. Any combination. P increase, P decrease, and the same for Q. Which is basically telling us, by just looking at this 1.5 for the year 2007 versus 1.4 in the year 2006, we actually cannot tell how come one number is bigger than the other. What we would like to see is, or what we would like to hope for, is that we want the quantity to be the main reason as to how come this number is changing. Price increasing mainly because we have actually higher inflation. Quantity increases. If this is actually due to quantity increase, this is definitely good news because we have more to consume, more to enjoy, and this would also imply we have better productivity compared to the year before. So what can we do in order to actually distinguish that 1.5 is actually bigger than 1.4 must be due to quantity changes? We have two types of measurement. First one is nominal GDP, or a nominal variable. If a variable is actually called a nominal variable, its value can change if the prices change and or quantity changes. What does this mean? Let us make up a very simple example. Suppose for the year 2006 and for the year 2007, we have only produced two products, food and clothing. The quantities were 10 and 10, and the prices per unit. So 10 units of food could be, say, 10 gift baskets of food. Each basket, there are many different types. For each basket, suppose in the year 2006, the price was $5 each. For clothing, it was 20. And for the year 2007, quantities 11 and 11. Price per unit 5.5 and 22. We can find a GDP for each of the 2 years, and the result will be the nominal GDP. So the nominal GDP in the year 2006 will be simply the size of the food industry plus the size of the clothing industry. So the size of the food industry would be 10 units times $5 each plus 10 units times $20 each. So 10 times 5, 50 will be the size of the food industry. 10 times 20, 200 will be the size of the clothing industry. Altogether, this will be 250. We can do the same thing for the year 2007. Nominal GDP, 2007. Once again, 11 units times 5.5. 11 units times 22. The total would give us 302.5. And of course, in reality, this number will be in the trillions. This number would also be in the trillions. In this very simplified example, we only produce two products across the 2 years. Now, nominal values could actually be quite misleading. 302.5 bigger than 250 could have been because of the fact that we have produced more. In this case, that would be yes, we did actually produce more, 11 and 11 versus 10 and 10. Or it could have been because of higher prices, which is also true, 5.5 versus 5, 22 versus 20. So both of these reasons actually account for how come 302.5 is actually higher than 250. Can we actually have a slightly different measurement so that whatever the values we get, we can tell right away it is actually because of production changes that have driven the higher number, as opposed to anything could have been happening, more production and or higher prices. Let's take out the price effect so that the new measurement, which we will call real GDP, would tell us something conclusive. If the number is higher, it must be due to higher production, higher productivity. So nominal values are not too good because too many possibilities could have explained how come one value is higher or lower than the other. We want to find the real GDP or the real variable. If we actually have a real variable, this means when the price changes, the real variable actually is not affected. We can focus on quantity changes. However, we cannot actually just take out the prices because the prices do actually perform two functions. The first one is, if we actually use prices, they would actually allow us to add food, which could be measured in kilograms. We convert the kilograms into dollars. Clothing could be measured in meters, but we can convert it into dollars. So because of the fact that we have apples and oranges, but we convert all of those into dollar signs, then we can actually add across different units of measurements. Because we have converted the units of measurement to pennies and cents. A second reason is that the price actually does reflect the value of the product. For example, if we actually have diamonds, we should not actually look at this in terms of the weight. We should actually look at this in terms of what dollar signs we should attach to them. Diamonds, the dollar sign would actually reflect the value, and hence the prices would actually reflect how much food is actually worth, how much clothing is actually worth, how much the diamonds are actually worth. So we cannot just drop the prices and just add across the units of the products. What can we do? Using the previous example, 2006, 2007, still the same two products, food and clothing. Quantities, 10 and 10. Prices per unit, still the $5 and the $20. So nothing has changed for the year 2006. 2007, the quantities we had before were 11 and 11. Price per unit, let us leave this blank for now. So we cannot actually take out the $5 and the $20 because the $5 would actually reflect the value of food, $20 reflect the value of clothing. What we can now actually do is, for these 2 years, let's actually pick one of them as being my base year. Suppose I actually pick the year 2006 as the base year. The basis for my comparison doesn't have to be 2006. I could have picked 2007. So I pick 2006 as the base year, the basis for my comparison. And then what I would do is I evaluate the quantities using the same set of prices across the 2 years. The result will be the real GDP. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put the $5 here for the year 2007 and $20 also for the year 2007. Basically, I have actually used this set of prices from my base year and used this same set of prices to evaluate different production quantities. So let us do that. The result would be my real GDP for the year 2006. Notice that because of the fact that we have used the year 2006 as my base year, nothing has actually changed. Quantities have not changed. Prices have not changed. Therefore, the value will be still the same as before, 250. So that means for the base year, nominal GDP value will be equal to the real GDP value. Because this is basically my starting point. This is only true for the base year. What can we do to find the real GDP for the year 2007? Very much the same as before. 11 units, but now $5, not the 550. 11 units, $20, not the 22. And plugging this into our calculator, we will be able to find 275. What is this 275? Because of the fact that we have not changed the prices 5 and 20, and yet we actually get a number that is higher than 250, we can then conclude 275 bigger than 250 must be due to quantity increase. And hence we can tell right away 2007 is actually more productive compared to 2006. Let us put all of these numbers together. The first example, we have 250 for the year 2006, less than 302.5. These were nominal GDPs. And with nominal GDPs, can we actually conclude 2007 is actually better than 2006? We actually do not know, because anything could have actually happened that have given us 302.5. Could have been just higher prices, or it could have been higher quantities, or it could be both. And hence, we cannot conclude anything if we look at nominal GDPs. And then we said, well, why don't we actually use 2006 as the base year? Use those prices and evaluate the quantities for 2007. And then we found 275. And we call these values real GDPs. Now we can conclude 2007 is now actually more productive than 2006. Because what we have done is we evaluated the quantities by using the same prices, and hence any difference across these two numbers must be due to changes in production, and in this case, increase in production. So most of the time when we hear in the media that we have economic growth in Canada year to year, this year versus last year we have 3% GDP growth, they actually tend to focus on real GDP, even though they don't exactly mention this. Given that we often use GDP to reflect the wealth of a country, let us look at the formal definition of GDP. The formal definition is developed by accountants who keep track of GDP numbers. GDP is defined formally as the monetary value of all final goods and services produced within a given period of time by factors of production located within a country. I underlined four main features, and let's look at each one of them in more detail. Monetary value of what we have produced. Monetary value would be just the price of the product times the quantities of the product. And we add across all of the different types of products and services. Suppose for Canada, we only have two industries, wheat and clothing. The monetary value would be simply how many tons of wheat we have produced times the corresponding price, plus how many pieces of clothing we have produced times the corresponding price, and then we add this across all of the different industries that we have. The resulting number would be my 1.5 trillion Canadian dollars. That would be my GDP. So recall 2007. We have many different types of products and services. This number summed up to about $1.5 trillion. As an aside, so anything that I put as an aside means this will not be in the exam, but for your interest, if you're curious, you can actually look at this. Where can we actually find more of the actual data? GDP data, real GDP, nominal GDP, from say 1910 until 1950 until say 2007. For Canada, for different countries. For Canada, feel free to look at Statistics Canada. And specifically, they have a database that is called CanSim. You can Google this and find CanSim. Within CanSim, you would actually find a whole bunch of data that they actually collected for Canada across many, many different years. Examples would include, of course, nominal GDP and real GDP. Real GDP, stats can actually give you base year from different years. It could be say 1980 as the base year, or it could be 1985, or it could be 2000, 2005. They would actually give you many, many different series. Nominal and real GDP could be for Canada as a whole, or it can also be in terms of in province. Provincial GDP, they also offer that as well. They would also include unemployment, and inflation, price indices, and many, many more. The second part says final goods and services. The keyword is final. Final means they're ready for consumption, as opposed to say intermediate goods. Further production is needed. Examples of final consumption would be say the food that we buy, the clothing that we buy, the furniture that we buy, and so forth. Intermediate goods would be say bricks. Unlikely we would actually buy bricks and just leave them as they are. Most likely we buy them as a firm, as a construction company, and build houses. Cement, and so forth. So final goods will be for enjoyment, ready for enjoyment. Intermediate goods will be for further production. GDP would tend to focus on final goods and services. It doesn't have to be. It's simpler. We can actually look at intermediate goods, but if we want to look at intermediate goods and try to find the GDP, we need to find the cumulative value added of the intermediate goods, and hence we need to be more careful. To show what this means, let us have a very simple example that we only produce one product, one car. That's all my GDP. Suppose the final price of the car. Let's look at how it's actually being produced. The parts are actually worth $5,000. The assembly firm would actually buy the parts and then assemble all the parts, become a car. The car will be sold for $11,000 to the shipping company. So the shipping company would buy this car for $11,000 and deliver this to the dealer. Once it gets to the dealer pays $15,000. And for simplicity, when the dealer actually sells the car actually sells for $15,000. So the final value of the car that we can drive home and actually enjoy it, the final price is $15,000. And hence, GDP will be $15,000. So by looking at the final price, that is my GDP. I could have actually looked at value added. How can we actually get the exact $15,000 if we look at value added? Let's look at the production process again. So intermediate production, or the value being added at each particular stage. The parts worth $5,000. The assembly firm bought the parts for $5,000, put them together, and then it is now worth $11,000. That means the contribution, the value being added by the assembly firm is the difference, 11,000 minus the 5,000. So the value being added by putting the stuff together is only equal to 6,000. What about the value added by the shipping company, the transportation? Shipping company got it for 11,000. By the time it arrives at the destination, it's worth 15,000. So the value being added because of the delivery will be the difference, 4,000. For simplicity, the dealer actually sells the car for exactly the same, $15,000, and hence the dealer has not added any value to the car. If we look at value added, 5,000 plus the 6,000 plus the 4,000, this will also give us 15,000. And notice that this is exactly the same as what we have above. So we can just look at the destination, look at the final price, $15,000, or we can actually look at the different processes in the production and make sure we look at the value being added in each process. Add up all of the value added, we should also still get the same number. So keep in mind, this is actually not equal to the parts, 5,000, and the assembly, 11,000. We have just double counted the $5,000. And it's not the 15,000 but the shipping. We have just double counted more of the numbers. And it's not 15,000 but the dealer. Because if we actually do it this way, the value of the car, this will give us 30,000, another 16, we will get 46. This number obviously is an exaggeration because we double counted, triple counted some of the numbers. This will be wrong. The third part of the definition says within a given period of time. It could be within a month or within 6 months or within a year. Suppose let's look at a year. The car was actually produced in the year 2005, but it was not actually sold until 2006. The $15,000 of the car, should it go into GDP for the year 2005 or for the year 2006? Think about this for a second. Would you choose 2005 or 2006? The answer is 2005. And why is that? Why is it not 2006? It was actually in 2005 that all of the production activities took place. So the workers were actually working in 2005 to actually make the car, to deliver the car, to assemble the car. Production actually took place in 2005. And remember, we actually said for simplicity, when the dealer actually sold the car, whatever services, used car salesman, or whatever advertising, whatever sweet talk they actually offer, we actually don't place any monetary value on those services. So the car was actually produced in 2005, production took place in 2005, and hence this will actually enter into 2005 GDP. For the year 2006, why not 2006? Because the sale of a product is basically driving it from one parking lot to another parking lot. That is just a transfer of ownership. So in 2006, the sale itself is simply a transfer of ownership, and hence nothing new is actually being produced. Now the question is, suppose the same car was actually sold as used in 2007. For simplicity, we sell the car as being used. We have not repainted it, cleaned it professionally, or touch up in any way. As it is, we sell it. How would the year 2007's GDP be affected? Suppose we sell the car for $2,000. The answer is nothing. Not affected. And once again, because of the fact that a sale is simply a transfer of ownership. And hence nothing new is actually being produced. And let's put aside the new license plates for now. We're just looking at the sale of this car by itself. I pay cash, you got the cash. We actually don't really have to report it to anyone if we put aside the legal stuff with the licenses. So the sale itself is actually has no effect on GDP whatsoever. So GDP altogether, does it actually measure when the product is actually being sold or when the product is actually being produced? Being produced. Because this is precisely where the economic activities, the production, the delivery, took place. The last part of the definition says factors of production, which means inputs. Factors of production located within a country. Located within a country, this is actually where the GDP, the D domestic part, where it actually got its name. So for Canada's GDP, gross domestic product, we have to look at everything that actually has been produced within the Canadian geographical border, domestically. Now the question is, we have foreign citizens who actually work in Canada. They produce goods and services. For example, say Filipino nannies or stem cell research scientists from Korea. If they're working in Canada, they're not Canadian citizens. Would the value of what they produce be counted as Canada's GDP? Yes or no? The answer is yes. And the main reason is because they're located within the Canadian geographical border, because they're located in Canada. And hence, that's where the gross domestic product, the domestic part, comes in. The second question is, we have Canadian citizens working abroad, students teaching English as a second language. They produce goods and services. Would the value of what they produce be counted as part of Canada's GDP? The answer is no, mainly because they're located outside of Canada. We have a slightly different measurement that we call gross national product, or GNP. GNP, the national part, means we actually want to focus on what Canadian citizens actually produce, and hence we focus on nationality. GDP and GNP are actually related. Actually, when we find the difference of these two numbers, the difference would actually tell us something. If we look at the year 2002, our GDP was actually 1154, GNP, quite similar, but only 1127. The difference of these two numbers, what is the interpretation? To do that, let us actually relate these two equations and put GNP on one side and put GDP on the other side. With GDP, we have to add something and then subtract something. With these two adjustments, then we will get GNP. So what should we add and what should we subtract? Think about this for a second. Gross domestic product says everything that is being produced within Canada. I don't care what kind of citizenship you have. GNP says I want to just focus on those who are actually Canadians. So GDP incorporates Filipino nannies who actually work here. I need to subtract this from gross domestic product. Because they're not Canadian citizens, I need to subtract the value of what they produce. And hence, I need to actually subtract the income earned by foreigners working in Canada. We need to also add in something. What do we need to add? Remember, we have some Canadian citizens working abroad. GMP wants to look at that. So we need to add in income earned by Canadians working abroad. With these two adjustments, we will go from GDP to GNP. Let's put the numbers back in. GDP was equal to 1154. GNP was equal to 1127. And hence, this bracket would have to be a negative number. And that would be 1154 minus 1127. That would be equal to the difference of 27. So 1154 minus 27 will give us 1127. What is the interpretation of the fact that this is a negative number? Interpretation? This actually means that on average, we actually have more foreigners working in Canada in terms of the income they earn. We actually have more foreigners working in Canada compared to Canadians working abroad. Why is this actually relevant? Because sometimes in the news, every once in a while, we tend to hear that we actually have a brain drain problem, meaning that we actually lose so many Canadian nurses or doctors or IT specialists to the US or to the rest of the world, and we actually have a drain, so going down the toilet in terms of the brains that we actually train. They just go to some other countries rather than working in Canada. This is probably true for some industries, for some sectors, but for Canada as a whole, we actually do have more foreigners in terms of how much they make compared to how much we actually have Canadians draining, going to work for other countries. So brain drain could be true for some industries, but probably not so true for the Canada country as a whole.